Hi, my name is Thomas Geesbrecht, and in this session I'm going to explain how to get started with DataMiner Object Models. I'm going to explain what DataMiner Object Models is all about, how you can create such model, how you can create instances. We're also going to do a little exercise that you can follow along at home as well, and then I'll close things off talking about some best practices. So let's get started. So what is DataMiner Object Models? The tagline here is enrich your operation with just any administrative data. And that's a bit what DataMiner Object Models is all about. It's about kind of storing this administrative data and being able to build applications with that data. So when you store objects in DOM, you can actually then use those objects to build applications, to visualize that data in applications, to also use that in automation scripts and so forth. And that application thing is kind of the most common use case. So on this slide, you can actually see a few examples of apps that you can make that will store their data in DataMiner Object Models. So in DOM for a short form of the name. So you, for example, have event administration, vehicle resource management, where you can store all your vehicles, asset management, where you can get an overview of all the assets within your company, servers, switches, routers, telecom equipment, and so forth. Ticketing is also a very common use case where you want to kind of keep track of tickets that come in, certain maintenance requests, or so forth. And you can actually also even use it for human resource scheduling, getting an overview of all the people available in your corporation or in your organization and be able to kind of plan them out. That's also something that you could do with DOM. To explain how the DataMiner object model can be created, I'll explain this with an example which is shown here. So we're actually going to model a vehicle, so like an OB van. So that's like a truck or a van that contains all the equipment that you need to make a television broadcast. So on the screen you can see a visualization of our model, which is actually a form component in the low-code apps. So if you're already familiar with low-code apps, you know that you have like components that you can drag on top of that. There's also the form component, and that's the kind of component that you'll need to create or visualize these kind of objects, these DOM instances. You can see we have a few fields here. So we have a license plate. So this is the license plate of our truck. This is just some piece of text. Our second field is location, which will be a drop-down. So if you click on this, you can actually see a drop-down of all locations. A third field is capabilities. This is also a drop-down, but here you can select multiple values. So here you can say, okay, my van supports HD, it supports Dolby Atmos, it supports satellite receiving and transmitting. And then a third one is size. And size is then also just a drop-down, just like location. And then the last field is number of cameras, and that's just a number. So the amount of cameras that are supported by a certain van. Within DOM, you have 4 core objects. You have the module settings, you have the section definitions, the DOM definitions, and the DOM instances. Let's delve a little bit deeper on each one of these. The first one is the module settings. And the module settings is some kind of cross-model grouping where you will group together a bunch of models. So it's kind of, you can see there kind of as a bucket of DOM models. And it will also contain a bunch of settings that are relevant for those specific models. So one of which is, for example, the script settings. There's a concept called CRUD scripts, and those are automation scripts which gets executed every time you create a DOM instance, like an object. For example, in our vehicles use case, every time you create a vehicle, an automation script gets executed, and there you can do something. For example, send an email to a certain administration team to say that a certain vehicle was registered. Another example of these settings are the history settings. So by default, if you create a DOM instance, like an object, like a vehicle, a history record will be written that says that user has created a new vehicle with these values at that time. And if you update a certain vehicle, you can also see that that person changed value X to value Y at that time. So that's very interesting for some kind of audit log, history, knowing what happened to your DOM objects. But if you don't need it, you can actually also disable this on a module level, and that way you will save some database requests as well. In general, these settings are for advanced use, so you actually don't need to kind of adjust these or touch these if you just simply want to create a model, a basic model. The module settings object contains a very important property called the module ID. That's actually the identifier of your module, so it's very important to give that kind of a clear name. And there's a few requirements there. It has to be between 1 and 40 characters, and it should only contain lowercase characters and underscores. So you can, for example, see here a module settings object with the ID my_vehicle_manager. So that kind of identifies that we will create a collection of DOM models that are relevant to vehicles. We want to create a vehicle manager. So that's it for the first one. It's just simply put a grouping of our models. So that's the first thing that you need to create. The second part is the section definitions with filter scripters. And the section definitions is kind of describing what we want to store. So that actually will contain which fields we want to have in our model. And those fields are defined using the field descriptors. So a section definition contains a collection of field descriptors. There's again a little visualization here. Section definition, it has an ID, which is a GUID, and then you can see a collection of field descriptors. So for every field that we want, we have a field descriptor. So if we look back at our form components, like the visualization here, we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fields. We will also have 5 field descriptors. So you see for the license plates, we have a field descriptor with a certain ID. Again, this can be chosen at random. It's just to differentiate between the different field descriptors that we have. And that will then have a name, license plate, so that will be the same as pictured here. And then we have a type string, since it's just a piece of text. And then, as another example, the last one in our list will be for the number of cameras. So we have one number of cameras, and this is of type long. That's a large number. I mentioned the type string and long, but there's actually a bunch more. So on the left, we have a list here of basic types, and these are the ones that are supported for just simple field descriptors. We have string, which is a piece of text, double, which is decimal number, long, a very large number, datetime is the date and time, a time span, a certain span of time, and then the last one, bool, which will be represented as a checkbox. So those are the basic fields, but we actually also have special fields. The first one is the auto increment, and that's actually a field descriptor which will automatically kind of generate a new value for you every time you save a new instance. So for example, you could use this in the context of a vehicle to generate a vehicle identifier, a human readable identifier for your vehicle. So every time you store a new vehicle, it will actually kind of increment the number for you. So the first save will be 1, the next one will be 2, and so on. The second special field is an enum, and that is actually kind of the field that we'll need to have our dropdown. So an enum field contains a list of predefined values, so a predefined discrete set of values where you will be able to choose one or multiple actually. We also have special fields that are kind of pointing towards other objects in DataMiner. So we have 3 special field descriptors for SRM where you can say or select a certain booking, a resource, or a service definition. So this is actually quite handy if you, for example, are creating a certain model that represents an order, and that order will eventually lead into a booking being created for that order. You can then have a field which contains the reference to the order that has been created. So that's also very handy to display that or to be able to understand that we have a certain link to an SRM booking. So that's not only for SRM, but even for DOM itself. So within DOM, the DOM instances, the objects, the vehicles, you could actually have a field that points to something else. So imagine that we store a vehicle and we also store a list of license plates because we want to also store a registration date or maybe some kind of other information related to license plates. So you have like a list of license plates, and then in your vehicle you can have a reference to one of those license plates. That's something that you can do with DOM instance field descriptors. The DOM instance value field descriptor is actually quite similar, so you also point to a specific instance in another model or another module even. But here we will actually point to a specific value. So to have another example, imagine you have like a list of vehicles and then you have like a technician which is responsible for that vehicle. So you again have like a separate model which represents a technician. That technician will have like a email address or even a telephone number. And then in the vehicle, you can point to specific that email address or telephone field. If you then have like a vehicle that you create and you have a drop down, you will, instead of seeing the name, or not only the name of the technician, you will also see that email and a telephone number. So that can be very handy for visualizing it nicely and being or more clearly explaining or more clearly defining what you are actually linking. And then the last kind of special filter descriptors that we have are the DataMiner elements, groups, and users. So there you can also reference a certain element. Imagine you have like a DOM model that represents a maintenance item, and you want to say these elements or this specific element will go into maintenance. Then you can use the DataMiner element filter descriptor to specify and store that element. So that's pretty much it for the section definitions. It simply is a list of the fields that we want to have in our model. And then we have our last kind of configuration object, the DOM definitions. If you look at the DOM definition, it's actually quite a simple object. It simply contains a collection of links to section definitions. So it says, hey, my DOM model, my vehicle, is represented by this section definition, and this section definition. In our case, we'll keep it simple and we'll just use one section definition, but it's possible to have multiple. You could have a section definition that kind of is a collection of fields related to the basic core information of your vehicle, but then you can have another section definition that contains additional info about the maintenance or additional info about certain technical characteristics. It could be very interesting to kind of group certain fields together in a section definition instead of having like one very large one, because that actually also allows you to reuse these section definitions in other models. Imagine you have certain types of trucks. You could actually have different DOM definitions that all use the same section definition. That can save you some time, and it will also allow you to more clearly display all these different vehicles that have those fields in common in a common way. So in a table, you will be able to display all these different trucks or all these different vehicles in the same table, and those fields that match will also match in the same column. So that can be very handy, something to keep in mind. So that's pretty much it for the DOM definition. It's pretty much a collection of all the section definitions for our model and kind of finalizes the creation of our model itself. And the last and final important object that we were going to talk about today is the DOM instances. Those are actually the objects that will be stored. So these are the vehicles in our case that we want to store. So there's actually a visualization here of a DOM instance where you have the DOM instance itself, and then this slightly darker color represents a section. So this is like a grouping of field values. And a field value is, as the name suggests, a value for a certain field. So we have a field value for the license plate field, and we actually kind of link that to the license plate using the ID of the field descriptor. So if I go back a little bit, you can see our field descriptor of the license plate. So that was 23E7 and so forth. And if you go back to our DOM instance, you can see 23E7 and so forth. So that's how you kind of link a value to a certain field descriptor. So for every section definition that you have in your DOM definition, you will have a section with your field values. The DOM instance is an object where you can have millions of the objects for. All of this is stored in a database, and all the querying is also done in a database, so you can efficiently search and retrieve all these instances. So let's kind of reiterate a little bit on those 4 objects. Let's start from the beginning, and I'll visualize it here on these slides. So the first thing that we need to create when we want to create a model is our module settings. So again, with an identifier, in this case, my_vehicle_manager. Then we create our section definition. So we want to define the fields that we want to have in our model. So we create a section definition, give it a certain ID, and then define for each field that you want a field descriptor. So in this case, it's simplified. We only have the license plate and the number of cameras. Once we have our section definition, we can create our DOM definition. And this is then, again, a simple object that has a link to our section definition. It says, hey, my vehicle actually needs to have values, and the values are in the section definition that is referenced here. And then the last one, if we want to create a vehicle, we create a DOM instance, and this DOM instance has a link to the DOM definition because it then kind of says this DOM instance represents a vehicle. And then we create a section for each section definition. There's only one in this case. And then a field value for each field descriptor that was defined. And that's pretty much it. So this is kind of the interlinking of all these objects explained again. Now, I explained how you can create a model, but how do you actually kind of create those objects? There's actually 3 ways to do that. You can do that via C# code, and as a developer myself, I also prefer this way. But if you're not that versed in the C# world, you can actually go for option 2, which is the DOM editor script. This is actually an interactive automation script which can be easily deployed from the catalog, and that will provide you a front end, a kind of a user interface to create these objects and to also alter any configuration in DOM. There's even a third option, which is the DOM designer script plus Excel. And this is kind of a simple way to define your model in an Excel and then import it by executing a certain automation script. This is nice for kind of getting started, but we generally recommend going the DOM editor route, since that will give you the most flexibility and also gets you kind of more familiar with the different objects. So let's look at an example. So this is kind of how the C# code looks like to define a DOM definition. So within C# we just instantiate a new instance of the DOM definition class, and then we have our collection of links to section definitions. We define a new link with the identifier, the ID of a certain section definition. So we have kind of defined the DOM definition now in memory, but now you have to send it to DataMiner, so to store it in a database as well. And we can do that using the DOM helper. So here you can see the DOM helper, and then you can call this method DOM definitions. So we want to do something with DOM definitions, and then call the actual kind of action method create. So you want to create DOM definitions. And we then just pass along our DOM definition objects. And if we call that, it will send this to the server, and it will then get back to us and say everything is fine. Or if something is wrong, it will also throw an exception for you with a clear error. So that's how the C# code looks like. Let's get to the DOM editor script. So this is kind of a screenshot of the DOM editor script. You can see here the list of all field descriptors for a certain section definition, and you can easily add one using the plus and so forth. And this is what we're going to use in the hands-on exercise. We're going to create a model from scratch using this DOM editor script. And then the last one is the Excel. Again, not something that I will personally recommend, but it's definitely available for you if you want to kind of get started with a sort of larger model and you don't want to click around in the DOM editor. This could be a way to get started. So I've just explained to you how you can create the model, but how then do you create the instances? The instances can also be created via code, or you can use the low-code app form, as I mentioned at the start of this presentation. So this is how the C# code to create a DOM instance could look like. You create a new DOM instance, provide the DOM definition ID, and then you can use the add or update field value method to provide the values. So you define for which section definition you want to add a value, for which field descriptor you want to value, and then the value itself. So in this case, we want to kind of assign the name John to who reported a certain kind of issue. And then you also have like an example to define the description. So we have a description here, one of the lights in the kitchen on the second floor does not work. And that value we assign to the field descriptor that represents the issue text. So you can see that we define the section definition, the field descriptor, and then the description itself. Here we have the full section definition and field descriptor objects, but you can actually also just define the IDs of those. So it's definitely not needed to kind of have the full object here. Once you have defined all the fields, you can store it in a database using the DOM helper as well. So here you see the DOM helper again, but this time with DOM instances instead of DOM definitions. And then we call the create method as well and provide our DOM instance. And that will create our DOM instance in the database. So that's it for the theory part. Now let's try it out with the hands-on exercise. What we're going to create is our vehicle model that I've already discussed. So the form that I showed you at the start, we're actually going to create that. And if you want to create this using the DOM editor, you of course need that DOM editor script. You can find it on the catalog when you just simply go to catalog.dataminer.services and then search for DOM editor. You should see it popping up there and you can deploy it on your system. So make sure to do that and then continue watching the video. Once you have deployed the DOM editor script, you should see this in the automation module in Cube. So if you open up the DOM folder, you should have a DOM main script, and then you'll see the DOM editor script. You can then execute the script, and we will have the DOM editor UI. On the system, we currently have no DOM models, so there's like nothing to see here. If you already have some models, you'll see like a list of these in this overview. So let's create our vehicle model. So as I mentioned during the theory part, the first thing that we need to create is the module settings. And we can do that by simply clicking New here. Let's pick a module ID. Let's call it my vehicle manager, and then click Create. So we have now created the module settings. The next part is to create our section definition. And we can do that by going into our module. So we click on Edit here, and then we can see the different objects that we want to create or can create. And the one that we have to choose is section definitions. You click on New, and let's call this section definition vehicle info. We now have to define all the fields that we want in our section definition, and that can be done by clicking on field descriptors. We currently have no field descriptors defined as this is a new section definition, so let's create them. The first one that I'll create is the license plate. So we can type the name here. After you have entered the name, you will see a few other fields. So the first one is optional, and that kind of defines whether or not the user needs to provide a value before a certain instance of this can be saved. So let's uncheck this since we want to have a license plate. You can also make a field read only, and that will mean that a user cannot change that. But we don't want that. The user has to provide a value. A tooltip is also possible. This will be displayed like with a little eye and the form components, and can be useful to also understand what the field is all about. And then the most important part is a type. So here you have a drop down of all the types that I mentioned during the theory part. And we're going to choose the string one, the default option. We also have a default value that you can enter here, and that will then automatically allocate this field in your form component when you create a new one, but we don't want that in this case. So that's pretty much it. We have just provided our license plate name, unchecked optional to make it required, and then provided the type, which is string, just a piece of text. Let's do that for our second field as well, which is the location. So let's call this location. We're also going to make this required, and this is a generic enum field descriptor. The generic enum field descriptor is the field descriptor that will allow us to define a list of values that the user needs to select. Let's give this enum a name, for example, locations, as this will contain all the locations. And then you have like an enum type here, you have int or string. This is kind of a bit of a technical thing. In general, you can leave it to integer. It just depends or just determines how the value itself is stored in the backend. With this checkbox, you can also allow multiple values. So if you want to only allow one selection of the list or multiple, you can define that with this checkbox. So let's define our values as well. So you can see there's like a little section here, entries, and if you click on that, a new line will pop up, and this is kind of the first value for our locations. So let's, for example, pick UK, add another one for Belgium, one for the USA, and then close things off with France. But you can pick whatever you want, of course. Once you have defined all your values, you can click on the back, and we have now completed our second field. The third field was the size. Again, make it required. It's also a drop-down of values, so we need the generic enum field descriptor again, and then call it sizes. So this is the name of our generic enum. Let's keep it as an int, and then define a few values. For example, a small vehicle, a medium-sized vehicle, and a large vehicle. There we go. And then we have a last field called number of cameras. And the number of cameras is just a number, so we can select the type here and choose int64. That's the kind of the technical name for a number. And that's pretty much it. We can go to back, and we see our 4 fields. So these are only the 4. We are going to skip the capabilities now. And then click apply. And that's very important that you do click apply, otherwise the kind of section is not saved, or the section definition is not saved to the database. If you would close this now, you would lose that information. So once you're done, click OK, and we have our section definition. So that's the second step. Now we go to the third step, and that is the DOM definition. So we get back to kind of the list of all the different objects that we can create. Let's click definitions, click new, give the name. Since we want to store vehicles, let's simply call it vehicles. And then we need to define the section definition that we just created. So we have to make a link to that section definition. Click on section definition links, click the plus, and it will automatically already select our vehicle info that we just created for you, since it's the only one that's currently available. Here you can also say allow multiple, and that's actually the multiple sections feature. So that's kind of this already kind of advanced thing where you can define multiple sections in your DOM instance for one section definition. So instead of defining the license plate once, you could define it multiple times. In this case, it doesn't make a lot of sense, of course, but there's cases where you want to add additional kind of sections for the same fields if you want multiples of those. But that's it. Let's get back. Click apply again to store our DOM definition to the server, and click OK. We see it here, looks great. And now we can go back again. So we have created our module settings, we have created our section definition, and we have created our DOM definition. And that should be pretty much it. So we have just created our model. So let's try it out. You can go to the kind of root web page of your DataMiner agent, and let's create a low-code app to see whether this is working right. If you're using a DaaS system, a DataMiner as a service system, you can go to dataminer.services, and then you'll see your DaaS system here with the home button. And you can simply click on home. There we go. We have landed on the home page of our DaaS, and now I can create a new low-code app. We're not going to do anything fancy right now. We're simply going to visualize our model using the form components. So let's skip these introductory parts. And we're simply going to pick the form component from this kind of section here. This like plus bar, search for form, and drag and drop this on the canvas. You can increase the size also a little bit. And then on the right, we have all the different data sources, kind of the places where you can get data from for your low-code app. We will also have the object manager definitions. If you open this one up, we should see our module. So that's great to see. It works as expected. And then we also have our definitions when you open up a certain module. So let's drag the vehicles on top of the form. And there we go. We can see the fields that we have created. So we have the license plate fields. It's displayed in red because it's required, just like the locations, with a nice drop down with the values that we have provided. And for the size, the same here, small, medium, large, as we have defined in the DOM editor tool. And then the last field, the number of cameras, we actually did not make this required. That's why it's not displayed in red. So this kind of proves that our model works as expected. If you want to also kind of understand how you can now create these instances, kind of create a low-code app around this, there's another session available where I will kind of continue on the story, and I will actually completely build an app around a certain DOM model. So be sure to check that one out as well. Let's talk a bit about best practices, because you need to keep a few things in mind when you build DOM models. The first thing, and very importantly, the smaller your DOM instance, the faster it will be to be processed. So if you have like a DOM model which has like thousands of fields, it will work, but it will be very slow. So we generally recommend to keep DOM instances small and only have it contain data that you actually need. So that's kind of the thing here, only add data that's actually required. And that's actually a very nice sentence in my opinion. It's easier to add a field later than remove one. So there's a tendency of people to kind of say, oh, I can add that field and I can add that field and so on. Oh, maybe that one could be interesting as well. But yeah, after a while, when you're actually using the model in production in your whole system, in your solution, you notice, yeah, I actually don't need all those fields. It's more cumbersome to fill them in, and yeah, they're actually not needed. Yeah, it's a bit harder to remove those then, definitely if there's already a DOM instance that uses that field, since within DOM, we kind of ensure that you cannot break your logic. You cannot break your model. So we won't allow you to delete the field configuration for a field that has been in use. So there's a few tricks around that or a few configuration things that you can do, but in general, we do recommend only adding fields that you actually need. It will not only make things clearer for you, for the user, but it will also benefit performance quite drastically. A second thing is avoid data duplication. So it's generally recommended, it's kind of similar as the first one to kind of minimize the amount of data stored, but by avoiding data duplication, you store the data only once, and that way you also don't have to keep things in sync. Another thing that we have actually seen in the field is that people start storing full JSON text in a string field. It could be handy definitely for those developers under us that say, okay, if I don't want to create my model or I don't want to expand my model, I just simply serialize some JSON here and put it in the model. But we generally avoid or suggest avoiding that, as it will make your model quite dirty and will be hard to manage it. And it also, again, will slow down your model as well. It's more efficient to define all these fields in your model itself and then store them that way. If you want to have like a second layer of kind of arrays or lists of so forth, you can use the multiple sections feature there as well. The fourth best practice is storing rarely used metadata in a separate DOM instance. So that could be a very interesting trick to kind of trim down your DOM instances is by splitting them up in separate ones. Definitely if you want to just display a certain instance on a timeline where you'll only be able to show like a few pointers of information, this could be a nice way to reduce the size. So let's kind of give a little example for this one. So imagine you have incidents. You store incidents and you have incident info, which simply contains the name of the incident, the description, the creator, and element IDs, like the IDs of the elements that are involved in an incident. But aside from that, you also have information on the actions that were performed for an incident. So certain technicians do certain actions, for example, decommission a certain device or investigate something, and they want to add notes here for those actions. You can actually use the multiple sections feature for this to kind of create a note for each action that was done. But you can also see after a while when a lot of actions have been done, there will be a lot of these sections in this DOM instance. And all this data is actually not needed if you want to visualize these incidents in a table or when you want to visualize these incidents on a timeline, for example. So every time you want to visualize that incident, you will have all these nodes which you can't visualize anyway. So that's all data that is lost, that is kind of retrieved without being of value. And that's where that metadata trick comes in. Instead of kind of having those multiple sections being part of your incident, you can actually have a separate DOM definition, so a separate model that will store those actions. So the incident itself won't contain the incident information or like the incident metadata, but it will have a pointer to it. It will have a DOM instance field descriptor that points to the incident's metadata DOM definition, and that will then contain all the different metadata instances. Another best practice to keep in mind is optimizing CRUD calls. Every call that you do to DataMiner on the database will have a certain overhead. So if you reduce the amount of calls that you do, it will have a nice benefit for your solution. There are a few tips to do so, is using bulk create, update, or delete whenever it's possible. So if you have like a script that wants to create a bunch of DOM instances at the same time, instead of doing a create for each one of them separately, you can actually send all of them in one go to the server. That will also be sent to the database in one go, and that will have a significant impact on your performance. Another one is doing multiple updates to the same DOM instance in the same script or code. So imagine within the script, you do a certain checks, you want to update an instance, and then after that you have some other checks and you need to update the instance again. Will do 2 instance updates and 1 script, and that should be generally avoided. It's best to kind of cache these changes and then only execute those updates at one time. And then the last one in this section is reading all relevant DOM data in one call. There may be situations where you will have lists of DOM instance IDs, so identifiers of DOM instances, and you want to retrieve those from the server. Instead of kind of looping over that list and getting them one by one, it's better recommended to kind of create a full filter that will contain all the IDs of these instances and get all of them in one go. We actually have a little handy method available, kind of a tool available called retrieve big OR filter. So you have tools.retrieve big OR filter. It's part of our SLNet types API. And there you can define a list of IDs. And then you can choose how to create a filter for each ID and then pass it along to the read methods of your helper. So that's a much more performant way of retrieving instances. The last best practice I want to share with you is disabling instance history. I've already hinted at this during the explanation of the module settings object. And by default, any change made to the DOM instance is tracked in a history record. So every time you do a change to your DOM instance, we'll store that person changed that field to that field at that time. If you, however, do not really need that information, you should disable it. So on the module settings, you can actually disable this history tracking, and that will reduce the load on the system and the database. This is definitely important if you have like a DOM manager that sees a lot of updates. So if you have like a lot of creates, updates, and deletes of instances, it could be very beneficial to just disable this history if you don't plan to use it anyway. To close off the session, I also want to highlight the DOM documentation in the DataMiner docs. We have some interesting pages there, including getting started with DOM, some code examples, tutorials, and even explanation of additional features that I did not mention today. You can quickly go to it using the aka.dataminer.services/DOM link. If you want to earn additional DevOps points, it is possible by letting your imagination run wild. You can create an additional module that kind of links together with the vehicle model, kind of extends it, and you can send a screenshot of the low-code app form for that using the assignment upload. If you are on YouTube, check out the description. There will also be some information on how to upload your screenshot there. A few examples of that kind of additional module could be like an insurance tracking system, maintenance history, or vehicle inventory manager. So that was it for this introduction, the getting started to DataMiner object models. I hope you enjoyed it, and I thank you very much for watching. See you in the next video.